The tape hiss is a sound I've come to know better than my own breathing. It is the sound of the space between heartbeats, the static that fills a life after the music has stopped. My name is Arthur Penhaligon, or at least that is the name I have been using. Names, like memories, can be shed, they can be buried, but some stains, they seep through the soil no matter how deep you dig the grave. I am telling you this not for forgiveness, nor for understanding. I am telling you this because the story must be told. It is a key, and every story needs a lock to turn in. Perhaps that lock is you. I found Blackwood Pines, Washington, the way a man finds his own ruin, by running from another. It sits on the map like a forgotten ink blot, a small damp town nestled in the perpetually weeping forests of the Pacific Northwest, choked by ferns and silence. The kind of place where the American dream came to die and be buried under a blanket of pine needles. I had come seeking anonymity, a quiet place to let the rot in my soul run its course. I was a journalist once. I wrote a story that got a man killed. His name was Marcus Cole, a name I repeat to myself in the dark, a penance, a rosary of guilt. My story, full of righteous fire and sharp-edged truths, had been a death sentence. So I traded my byline for a bartender's apron and my ambition for the bottom of a whiskey bottle. Blackwood Pines seemed the perfect tomb for a man already dead. The town itself felt preserved in amber. The main street was a single artery of tired-looking brick buildings with faded paint, their windows like vacant eyes. There was a diner that smelled of stale coffee and bacon grease, a general store where the proprietor watched you with the predatory stillness of an owl, and a sheriff's office that looked more like a relic than a bastion of law. Towering over it all, at the edge of town, was the skeletal finger of the old St. Giles Cathedral, its windows long shattered, its stone blackened by a fire half a century ago. The locals spoke of it in whispers, if they spoke of it at all. They were a quiet people, their faces carved with a kind of generational weariness. They had the look of folks who knew a terrible secret, and had long ago decided that silence was the only acceptable prayer. My life settled into a dull, predictable rhythm. Wake, work, drink, sleep. The rain was a constant companion, a soft, percussive drumming on the roof of my small, rented cabin at the edge of the woods. It was a sound that seemed to wash the color from the world, leaving everything in shades of gray and bruised purple. The cabin was old, the wood groaning under the weight of the damp. It came with a strange painting above the fireplace, a depiction of the town, but rendered in unsettling, feverish strokes. The sky in the painting was a sickly yellow, and the trees looked like grasping claws. I often found myself staring at it, feeling an inexplicable dread crawl up my spine. The rhythm was broken on a Tuesday in late October. The rain had paused, leaving the world shrouded in a thick, cold fog that clung to the ground like a shroud. A child was missing. Her name was Lily Thorne, a 7-year-old girl with hair the color of corn silk and eyes that held the clear, untroubled blue of a summer sky. I had seen her sometimes playing in the small, unkempt park near the center of town, a splash of vibrant life in a monochrome world. Now she was gone, vanished from her own backyard sometime between dusk and the time her mother called her in for supper. Sheriff Brody, a man whose frame seemed too large for his small office and whose face was a roadmap of disappointments, organized the search. He was a practical man, a man who believed in evidence you could hold in your hand. He spoke of runaways, of accidents in the woods, of the river that snaked its way past the town's edge. But as I watched the townspeople gather, their faces pale and taut in the fog, I saw a fear that went deeper than the thought of a lost child. It was an ancient fear, a familiar one. It was the fear of a debt coming due. I joined the search, not out of any sense of civic duty, but because the silence of my cabin had become unbearable. The disappearance of a child had scraped a raw nerve, reminding me of other lives I had failed to protect. The woods around Blackwood Pines were a labyrinth of colossal Douglas firs and western hemlocks, their branches so thick they blotted out what little light penetrated the fog. The air was heavy with the smell of wet earth and decay. We moved in a scattered line, our voices swallowed by the oppressive quiet, the snap of a twig underfoot sounding as loud as a gunshot. They found only one thing in the Thorns' backyard, near the rickety fence that separated their property from the encroaching forest. It wasn't a footprint or a piece of torn clothing. It was a small, crudely carved object placed carefully on a flat stone. It was a raven, fashioned from a piece of what looked like black volcanic glass, obsidian. Its eyes were tiny, empty pits, but they seemed to watch us, to mock our frantic search. Sheriff Brody bagged it as evidence, his expression tight, but I saw a flicker of something else in his eyes, recognition, or perhaps resignation. Days turned into a week. The search parties dwindled. The initial frantic energy curdled into a sullen, quiet despair. Lily Thorne's face, smiling from a school photograph taped to the window of the general store, became a ghostly accusation. The town seemed to pull in on itself, the doors closing a little earlier, the curtains drawn a little tighter. The whispers, however, grew louder. I'd catch fragments in the diner, at the bar, old wives' tales, stories of the Taker of the Pines. A local bogeyman used to scare children into behaving. But the way they said it now, the word held a new terrible weight. My journalistic instincts, long dormant and drowned in alcohol, began to stir. This wasn't just a missing person case, this was a story, and the story had roots that went deep into the black soil of this town. I started asking questions, a dangerous pastime in a place that prized silence. I tried talking to Caleb Thorne, Lily's father. He was a shell of a man, his eyes hollowed out by grief and sleepless nights. He just shook his head, muttering about a song. "The song," he'd whisper, his gaze fixed on the woods. She kept humming it, a song I'd never heard before. He couldn't remember the tune, only the feeling it gave him. A coldness, he said, like a cellar door opening in his heart. I sought out the town's only other public figure, Father Michael, the priest of the town's functioning but sparsely attended Catholic church. He was a man who seemed to be wrestling with his own ghosts. His hands trembled when he raised the communion chalice, and his sermons were less about salvation and more about the nature of inescapable sin. When I asked him about local legends, about the Taker, his face closed like a fist. "Every town has its shadows, Mr. Penhaligon," he said, his voice raspy. "It is the nature of man to create devils to explain his own failings. The only evil here is the one that lives in the hearts of men." But his eyes darted towards the boarded-up windows of the old burned St. Giles Cathedral on the hill, and I knew he was lying. My investigation led me to the town library, a dusty, neglected place run by a woman named Evelyn Reed. She was in her late 50s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing. She was the town historian, a descendant of one of the founding families. Unlike the others, she seemed willing to talk, though a palpable nervousness underlaid her words. She confirmed the existence of the legends. "They're just stories," she said, her fingers tracing the spine of a leather-bound book. "Pioneer folklore. A way to cope with the harshness of life out here." She showed me old town records, census data, birth and death certificates. It was all maddeningly normal. But as I spent hours poring over the brittle, yellowed pages, a pattern began to emerge. A faint, almost invisible pattern. Every 25 years, almost to the day, a child would vanish. It was never recorded as an abduction. It was a drowning, a fall, a fever that came on suddenly in the night. Always plausible, always tragic, always isolated. But when viewed together, laid out on the long library table, it was a horrifyingly precise calendar of loss. The last one was 25 years ago, a boy named Samuel. The official cause of death was exposure after getting lost in the woods. Evelyn paled when I pointed it out. "It's a coincidence," she whispered, but the conviction in her voice was gone. "This land is unforgiving. It's a sad, tragic coincidence." That night, I couldn't sleep. The whiskey wasn't working. The silence in my cabin was deafening, broken only by the creaking of the old wood. I kept thinking about Caleb Thorne's words. The song. I sat in the armchair, staring at the unsettling painting above the fireplace. The sickly yellow sky seemed to swirl. I closed my eyes, and for the first time I heard it. It was faint, a high, thin melody that seemed to come from the walls themselves, or perhaps only from the fractured corridors of my own mind. It was a lullaby, simple and deeply melancholic. The words formed in my head unbidden. "Hush now, child, the pine trees sigh, the willow weeps for you. Close your eyes and say goodbye, the roots will see you through." A wave of cold dread washed over me, so intense it made me gasp. It was a cold that had nothing to do with the damp October air. It was a primal, ancient cold. I opened my eyes and my blood froze. The painting, it had changed. In the foreground, near the edge of the painted forest, a small figure had appeared. A child with corn-silk hair, her back to me, walking towards the dark, grasping trees. I stumbled back, knocking over my chair. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. I was losing my mind. The grief, the guilt, the alcohol. It was all finally catching up to me, manifesting as ghosts and changing paintings. I had to believe that. The alternative was too monstrous to contemplate. I grabbed the bottle of whiskey from the table and drank until the melody faded, and the painting once again became just a collection of unsettling brushstrokes, the small figure gone as if it had never been there. But I knew what I had seen. And I knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that the story of Blackwood Pines was not about a missing child. It was about a hungry one, and it was just beginning to feed. My past was a ghost that walked beside me, and its name was Marcus Cole. He had been an accountant at a powerful corporation, a whistleblower who had come to me with ledgers full of cooked books and evidence of a massive fraud that reached into the highest echelons of government. He was terrified, a man out of his depth, and I, in my hubris, saw only the story. The Pulitzer, the fame. I pushed him. I promised him protection I couldn't guarantee. I ran the story. The corporation's lawyers tore him apart, not in a courtroom, but in the press. They painted him as a disgruntled, unstable employee, a fabricator. They ruined his life, his reputation, his family. 2 weeks after my story ran, he put a gun in his mouth. My source, my responsibility, my sin. I saw his face in every reflection, heard his whispered accusations in every quiet moment. Coming to Blackwood Pines was my attempt at a secular monastery, a place to serve out a life sentence of self-loathing. But the ghost of Marcus Cole had followed me here, and now it had the face of a 7-year-old girl. The discovery of the 25-year cycle was a turning point. It transformed my drunken, guilt-fueled curiosity into a cold, sober obsession. I stopped drinking. The clarity was agonizing. The world seemed sharper, harsher, and the silence of the town was no longer a comfort but a threat. Every shadow seemed to hold a waiting figure. Every gust of wind through the pines seemed to whisper that dreadful lullaby, "The willow weeps for you." The melody was an earworm, a parasite that had burrowed into my brain. I needed more than Evelyn's public-facing archives. I needed the town's hidden history. My instincts told me that Father Michael was a gatekeeper, and his fear was the key. I went to see him again, not at the church, but at the small, bleak rectory behind it. I found him in his study, surrounded by books on theology and demonology, a half-empty bottle of altar wine on his desk. He looked like a man who had been praying for an answer and was terrified one might actually come. "It's a pattern, Father," I said, my voice low. "Lily Thorne is not the first. Samuel Miller 25 years ago. A girl named Sarah before that. Every quarter century this town gives up a child. You know it, don't you?" He flinched as if I had struck him. He stared into his wine glass, the deep red liquid swirling. "You are meddling with things you cannot possibly comprehend, Mr. Penhaligon," he rasped. "This is a sorrow that is ancient and necessary." Necessary. I felt a surge of cold fury. A child's life is necessary. For what? To keep the logging industry profitable? To ensure a good harvest of rain-sodden misery? To keep the balance, he whispered, his eyes wide with a terror that was utterly genuine. To pay the tithe. He finally looked at me, his face a mask of anguish. When the first settlers came here, this land was already old. It was not empty. There was something, a presence. A consciousness in the soil, in the trees, in the very rock. They called it many things. The scribe of sorrows, the one who waits beneath the pines. It fed on despair, on memory, on grief. It was a psychic black hole. He told me the story, the one that wasn't in Evelyn Reed's official histories. The first settlers, the Reeds and the Millers and the Thorns, nearly starved their first winter. They were plagued by accidents, by madness, by a crushing despair that drove several to take their own lives. They realized they were squatting on land that belonged to something else. So they made a pact, a bargain born of desperation. They performed a ritual, offering up their collective sorrow, their fears, and a promise of a future offering, a single pure vessel of life and memory to sate the entity's hunger and buy them peace. A tithe, a child, once a generation. It's a lie, I said, but my own voice lacked conviction. The obsidian raven, the 25-year cycle, the town's suffocating silence. It all clicked into place with a horrifying, sickening logic. Is it? He countered, a bitter smile on his lips. Look at this town. We have no major crime, no real poverty. We are insulated from the horrors of the outside world. We have peace, but that peace has a price. The silent requiem. That is what the founders called the ritual. They believed they were saving their descendants, creating a sanctuary. You're a priest, a man of God. How can you stand for this? This is human sacrifice. His face crumpled. I came here 30 years ago, a young idealistic man, ready to fight the devil, and I found him. But he wasn't a creature with horns and a pitchfork. He was a system, a tradition, a town full of people who would rather sacrifice one of their own than face the alternative. He gestured wildly around the room. I tried to stop it 25 years ago, when Samuel Miller was chosen. I preached against it. I told them God would not abide it. They didn't listen. They locked me in this rectory. And when I got out, the boy was gone. And the town was quiet again, peaceful. The crushing weight we had all been feeling for months was lifted. I lost my faith that day, Mr. Penhaligon. I lost it to a God that answered prayers. He was a broken man, a collaborator by inaction. His guilt was as palpable as the damp in the walls. He told me the ritual was centered around the old burned-out cathedral, St. Giles. The fire, he said, hadn't been an accident. It was set by Samuel Miller's father, a desperate futile act of rebellion after his son was taken. Armed with this terrible knowledge, I knew where I had to go. Under the watchful, disapproving eyes of the town, I crossed the muddy field to the ruins of St. Giles. The building was a hollowed-out carcass. The roof was gone, allowing a perpetual grey twilight to fill the nave. The stone walls were scorched black, and the floor was a treacherous carpet of fallen masonry and damp, rotting leaves. The air was thick with the smell of old smoke and something else, something metallic and unsettling, like old blood. In the center of the nave, where the altar once stood, the flagstones had been cleared away, revealing a large iron trapdoor with a heavy ring. It was rusted but not sealed. It took all my strength, but I managed to pull it open. A blast of cold, stagnant air rushed up, carrying the scent of deep earth and absolute stillness. A stone staircase spiraled down into perfect darkness. My phone's flashlight cut a weak, trembling beam into the gloom. I descended, my footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. The staircase opened into a vast, circular chamber, clearly man-made. The walls were rough-hewn stone, slick with moisture, and they were covered in carvings, thousands of them. Not Christian symbols, but something far older, more pagan. Spirals, knots, and a recurring, terrifying motif. A stylized raven, its wings outstretched, its beak open as if in a silent scream. In the center of the chamber was a stone altar, identical to the one Father Michael had described. It was stained with something dark. But it was what was on the altar that made my breath catch in my throat. Another obsidian raven, larger than the one found in the Thorns yard, and beside it, a small leather-bound book, a journal. I picked it up, my fingers trembling. The handwriting inside was elegant, looping script, faded with age. It was the journal of Jonathan Reed, Evelyn's ancestor, one of the town's founders, and it was a confession. It detailed the first winter, the despair, the contact with the scribe of sorrows. It described the bargain, but it also described the entity in horrifying detail. It didn't just consume the child, it absorbed them. Their memories, their life force, their potential, all used to patch the thinning veil between its realm, a place of silent, eternal thought, and our world. The journal spoke of the entity's whispers, its promises of knowledge, of an end to pain. Jonathan Reed wrote not as a reluctant participant, but as a high priest, a man seduced by the power he had been granted. The most chilling part was a passage near the end. The Requiem is not merely a payment, but a reinforcement. The scribe is a breach in the world, a wound that weeps into reality. We do not feed it, we bandage it. The child is not a sacrifice, but a suture of pure soul, stitching the wound closed for another generation. Should the ritual ever be interrupted or the payment refused, the wound will not simply open. It will tear, and all the world will become as this dark valley. A sound from the staircase behind me made me spin around, my heart leaping into my throat. It was Evelyn Reed, her face as white as bone in the beam of my flashlight. She held an old rust-pitted lantern. "You should not be here," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "This is not your story, Mr. Penhaligon." "Lily Thorne is going to be the next suture, isn't she?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "You're her descendant, Jonathan Reed. You're the keeper of this horror." Tears streamed down her face, but her expression was hard as granite. "I am the keeper of this town. I am the guardian of a pact that has kept this world safe for 200 years. You see a monster. I see a terrible, necessary medicine." "Where is she, Evelyn?" "It has already begun," she said, her voice dropping to a ritualistic cadence. "The scribe has been awakened. The tithe has been called. The requiem must be completed." As she spoke, a low humming sound began to fill the chamber. It resonated in my bones, in my teeth. It was the lullaby. "The willow weeps for you." But it was distorted, layered with discordant whispers that sounded like 1,000 voices speaking at once. The air grew cold, a biting, unnatural chill. The flame in Evelyn's lantern guttered and died, plunging us into the near-total darkness of my flashlight beam. And then I saw it. On the far side of the chamber, where the shadows were deepest, something was moving. It wasn't a solid form. It was a patch of darkness that was darker than the surrounding black, a void that seemed to drink the light. It shifted, coalesced, and for a single heart-stopping moment, it took the shape of a tall, impossibly thin man in old-fashioned clothing, his features indistinct, a being made of pure shadow and sorrow, the scribe of sorrows. My flashlight flickered, the humming intensified, and from the darkness at the base of the shadowy figure, a small, whimpering sound emerged. A child's cry. "It's too late," Evelyn breathed, a sound of both terror and reverence. "It's here." Then came the first twist, the one that broke the investigation and my sanity in two. A heavy, shuffling footstep on the stairs. A beam of a powerful flashlight cut through the gloom, pinning Evelyn and me against the far wall. Sheriff Brody stood at the bottom of the stairs, his shotgun leveled not at the shadowy entity, but at me. "Drop the book, Penhaligon," he said, his voice flat and dead. "The town has its ways. You're interfering." He wasn't just the law. He was an enforcer of the pact. He was part of it. My only potential ally in the sane world was a guardian of the madness. The humming in the chamber grew to a deafening roar, a psychic scream that vibrated through the very stone. The darkness swirled, and I saw a flash of corn silk hair, a small hand reaching out from the void before being pulled back in. My flashlight flickered again and went out, leaving us in the suffocating absolute black. The last thing I heard before the chaos erupted was Sheriff Brody's voice, not angry but weary, resigned. "Some things are better left buried." The darkness was a living thing. It pressed in from all sides, thick and suffocating, smelling of damp earth and ozone. The humming wasn't just a sound, it was a pressure, a physical weight on my chest, my skull. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through my resolve. Brody's light was gone, either turned off or swallowed by the oppressive gloom. I could hear his ragged breathing somewhere to my left, Evelyn's soft, terrified whimpers to my right. The child's cry had been silenced, absorbed into the roaring static. "Brody, you son of a bitch!" I yelled, my voice sounding small and thin. "What have you done?" "What we've always done." His voice came back, strained and close. "Survive. Now stay put. This part is not for outsiders." My journalistic instincts, the part of me that ran toward the fire, took over. I couldn't be a passive observer again. Not after Marcus Cole. I still had the heavy journal in my hand. I lunged in the direction of Brody's voice, swinging the book like a club. I connected with something solid, his shoulder, I think, and heard him grunt in pain. His flashlight clattered to the stone floor, its beams spinning wildly, illuminating fractured scenes of terror. Evelyn's face, a mask of horror. The slick, carved walls, Brody stumbling back, raising his shotgun, and for a fraction of a second, the beams swept across the altar. The shadowy figure of the scribe was gone. In its place stood Lily Thorne. She was just standing there, her back to us, perfectly still. She wasn't crying anymore. She seemed calm, transfixed. But the air around her shimmered like heat haze off asphalt, and the darkness seemed to cling to her, wrapping around her ankles like grasping tendrils. The sight of her, so small and vulnerable, broke something in me. This wasn't an ancient pact. It was the murder of a child, dressed up in folklore and fear. "We have to get her out of here!" I screamed, scrambling for Brody's dropped flashlight. "No!" Evelyn's voice was a shriek. "You'll break the seal! You'll doom us all! The requiem must be completed!" I found the flashlight and pointed its beam at the girl. "Lily!" I called out. "Lily, come to me!" She didn't turn. She just slowly raised a hand and pointed towards the wall behind the altar. My light followed her gesture. There, on the stone, a new carving was appearing, etching itself into the rock as if burned by acid. It was a perfect, detailed image of a raven. As I watched, a dark, thick liquid like blood or tar began to seep from the carving's eye. The humming stopped. The sudden silence was more terrifying than the noise. It was a perfect dead void. "What's happening?" Brody grunted, getting to his feet. "You fool," Evelyn sobbed. "You've interrupted it. The offering has been seen, but not accepted. The suture has been threaded, but not tied. You've broken the rhythm." Lily Thorne slowly turned around. Her face was serene, placid, but her eyes were gone. In their place were two pits of swirling, absolute darkness, like the hollow eyes of the obsidian raven. When she spoke, it was not her voice that came out. It was a chorus of voices, ancient and layered, speaking in perfect, eerie unison. "The story is incomplete," the chorus said. "A new teller is required." And then she smiled. It was the wrong kind of smile on a child's face. It was ancient and knowing and full of a terrible, alien amusement. The temperature in the chamber plummeted. Frost began to creep across the floor from where she stood, tracing delicate, fern-like patterns on the stone. The blood-like substance from the raven carving on the wall began to drip faster, puddling on the floor. This was the consequence of an interrupted ritual, not a monster unleashed, but a corruption, a twisting of the rules. The entity hadn't been fed. It was changing its method of feeding. "We need to go, now," Brody said, his voice stripped of all authority, filled only with raw fear. He grabbed my arm, his grip like iron. "There's nothing we can do here." "We can't just leave her," I yelled, trying to pull away. "That's not Lily Thorne anymore," Evelyn whispered, her face ashen. "That's just the vessel." "The scribe is looking through her eyes." The girl thing took a step towards us. The chorus of voices spoke again, a sound that seemed to emanate from the very walls. "The debt remains. The cycle is broken. A new one must begin. A new history must be written." I was frozen, mesmerized by the impossible sight. Brody, however, acted. He shoved me hard towards the stairs. "Go! Get out of the church!" he roared, and then he did something I never would have expected. He turned his flashlight beam away from the girl and onto Evelyn Reed. "You!" he snarled. "You're the keeper of the law. How do we fix this?" Evelyn stared at the approaching child, her body trembling. "There is no fixing it. The pact is void. The wound is tearing. It will not be a single payment now. It will take everything." Brody racked his shotgun, the sound echoing like a thunderclap in the confined space. He wasn't aiming at the child. He was aiming at the altar. "Then we burn the whole damn library down," he growled. He fired. The blast was deafening. The ancient stone altar exploded, sending shards of rock flying through the chamber. The girl thing shrieked, a sound that was not human, a sound of pure static and rage that felt like needles in my brain. The darkness in her eyes intensified, pulsed, and the entire chamber was plunged back into blackness. I didn't wait. I scrambled up the stone steps, tripping and crawling, driven by pure animal terror. I burst out of the trapdoor into the nave of the ruined church, gasping the cold, damp air. The world outside seemed unnaturally quiet. Behind me, I heard another shotgun blast, followed by a human scream of agony. Brody or Evelyn, I couldn't tell. Then a final guttural roar from the depths that shook the very foundations of the church. And then silence. I ran from St. Giles across the muddy field, not daring to look back. I didn't run towards the town, towards the lights and the other people. I ran towards my cabin at the edge of the woods. I burst through the door, slammed it shut, and leaned against it, my body shaking uncontrollably. My eyes fell upon the painting above the fireplace. It had changed again. The scene was the same, the town of Blackwood Pines under a sickly yellow sky. But now, a thick black fog, like ink dropped in water, was rolling in from the edges of the canvas, obscuring the houses, the trees, the street, and in the center of the town square where the park used to be, there was now a figure. A tall, thin man made of shadow, holding the hand of a small girl whose eyes were black pits. They were looking directly out of the painting, at me. My sanity, already frayed, finally snapped. The line between what was real and what was a hallucination had been erased. Was the entity contained in the painting? Was the painting a window, or was my mind simply projecting my terror onto the canvas? Over the next few days, a strange and terrible quiet fell over Blackwood Pines. No one spoke of the events at the church. Sheriff Brody's office was empty. His car was gone. Evelyn Reed's library was closed, a family emergency sign taped to the door. It was as if they had both ceased to exist. Lily Thorne did not return home. But the missing posters also vanished from the shop windows. The town was trying to forget. It was scrubbing the record clean. But something was fundamentally wrong. The weather grew bizarre. The perpetual drizzle was replaced by a constant, thick, unmoving fog that never burned off, even at midday. Time itself seemed to warp. Days blurred into one another. I'd fall asleep in what felt like the evening and wake up moments later to the same gray, featureless twilight. My watch stopped working. The battery in my phone died and would not recharge. The people I saw on the street, the few who ventured out, looked different. Their faces were blank, their eyes vacant. They moved slowly, aimlessly, like sleepwalkers. They never made eye contact. They were husks. The town was no longer a prison for an entity. The entity was becoming the town. The lullaby was a constant presence now, a faint, maddening whisper at the edge of hearing, and I began to have flashes. Memories that weren't my own. I saw the founding of the town through Jonathan Reed's eyes, feeling his mix of terror and exultation. I felt the cold panic of Samuel Miller as he was led into the woods. I felt the crushing despair of his father as he lit the match that would burn St. Giles. The memories of the town, the memories the scribe had consumed, were leaking into me. I barricaded myself in the cabin. My only companion was the painting, my only anchor to what I thought was reality. But the painting kept changing. The fog within it grew thicker, blacker. Other figures began to appear in the mist, shadowy and indistinct, their faces turned away. The townsfolk. I recognized the proprietor of the general store, the waitress from the diner. They were being absorbed into the canvas, into the story. It was during one of these long, terrifying vigils, staring at the painted nightmare, that the second major twist revealed itself, a realization so profound it felt like a physical blow. It started with a memory of Marcus Cole. In my mind, I saw his face twisted in despair just before he pulled the trigger. But something was wrong. Behind him, through the window of his sterile city apartment, I didn't see a skyline. I saw pine trees. The dense, weeping pines of Blackwood Pines. The memory shifted. It wasn't my memory of being told about his death. It was the memory of his death. I was there, in the room. But how? I had been hundreds of miles away when it happened. My head throbbed, a splitting headache that brought with it a flood of disjointed images. A train ticket, a long journey through a rainy landscape, a meeting in a dimly lit bar, not to get a story, but to deliver a message. Marcus Cole, his face frantic, telling me, "They know I'm here. The town. It doesn't let you leave. You have to tell them I'm sorry. I'll do anything." And I, a younger, more naive version of myself, not understanding, saying, "Who are they? What town?" The truth hit me. Marcus Cole wasn't a corporate whistleblower from the city. He was from Blackwood Pines. He had been the intended tithe from a generation before Samuel Miller, a boy who had somehow escaped the ritual and fled into the outside world. He had tried to build a new life to forget, but the town, or the entity that ruled it, had a long memory and a longer reach. They had been hunting him, and my story, the one I wrote that exposed him, it wasn't about corporate fraud. That was the cover he had given me, a desperate lie to get his story out. The real story, the one I had unwittingly told the world, was about a man on the run from a dark secret in a small Washington town. My article hadn't led corporate lawyers to him. It had been a beacon, a signpost that led the enforcers of the pact, people like Brody, or perhaps people even more dedicated, right to his door. They had come for him. And faced with being dragged back to that altar, he had chosen his own way out. My guilt was not that of a reckless journalist. It was the guilt of a Judas goat. I hadn't just gotten him killed. I had returned a lost sheep to the slaughterhouse. The foundation of my entire broken identity, the sin I had been atoning for, was a lie. The truth was infinitely worse. This horrifying revelation was just the prelude. As I stared, shaking at the painting, another memory surfaced, this one far older, far deeper, a memory from childhood. Marie. I saw a small boy with my face, my eyes, standing in the nave of St. Giles, but it wasn't a ruin. It was whole, filled with flickering candlelight. The air was thick with incense and fear. Jonathan Reed stood at the altar, his face grim. He was holding the hand of another child, a little girl, my sister. I didn't have a sister. The memory was sharp, vivid. I remembered her name, Sarah, the name of the child who had vanished 50 years ago, a generation before Samuel Miller. The ritual was happening. My father, a man I could barely picture, was screaming, trying to fight his way through the grim-faced townsfolk. My mother was clutching me, sobbing, hiding my face in her coat. But I peeked. I saw Jonathan Reed lead my sister to the altar. I saw the darkness swirl. I heard her small cry. And then I remembered what happened next. My father, in his grief and rage, broke free. He lunged for the altar, not to save his daughter, who was already gone, but to destroy the focus of the ritual. He toppled a great candelabra. The fire that burned St. Giles wasn't set by Samuel Miller's father decades later. It was set that night by my father. We had escaped. My mother and I, we had gotten away in the chaos, fled Blackwood Pines, and never looked back. She had erased the memory, erased my sister, erased my father, buried the trauma so deep that it became a blank slate. My entire life had been built on a foundation of erased history. My past wasn't just mired in guilt, it was a complete fabrication, a story told to a child to protect him from a truth his mind couldn't handle. I wasn't an outsider who had stumbled into this town's nightmare. I was a part of it. I was a survivor. My blood was intertwined with this soil, with this curse. My return to Blackwood Pines hadn't been an accident, a random choice of a place to hide. The town had called me back. The scribe, its ritual broken, its seal tearing, was calling back a piece of itself, a loose thread from its own unraveling history. This led to the third, final, and most devastating realization, the one that explained everything. The warped time, the changing painting, the leaking memories. The interrupted ritual hadn't just corrupted the town. It had corrupted the narrative structure of reality itself. I looked at my hands, at the dusty floorboards of the cabin, at the swirling fog outside the window. I wasn't in the present day looking back on a past tragedy. I was in the wrong part of the story. The events I was remembering, Lily's disappearance, the discovery in the archives, the confrontation in the tunnels, hadn't happened yet. Or perhaps they had happened and were happening and would happen all at once. Time in Blackwood Pines was no longer a linear path. It was a loop, a tangled knot. I was a ghost, unstuck in time, experiencing the echoes of the future and the trauma of the past simultaneously. The Scribe of Sorrows didn't just consume memories. It was a being of pure narrative, and its prison had become a chaotic, unedited manuscript. I was a character trapped in a story that was being furiously, insanely rewritten. And as I stared at the painting, at the fog consuming everything, I understood my purpose. I was not here to be a victim or a hero. The scribe had called me back for a reason. As a blood descendant of the one who first broke the ritual, I was the only one who could either perform the ultimate repair or the final demolition. The truth of the town was laid bare. It was not a place. It was a wound in the fabric of the universe, a metaphysical prison designed to contain a being of pure story. The founders, in their arrogance, hadn't just made a pact. They had appointed their descendants as eternal wardens, using lives as the mortar to patch the prison walls. The silent requiem was the act of feeding the scribe a new, short, tragic story to keep it occupied, to prevent it from turning its attention to the grand, overarching narrative of reality itself. My interruption of the ritual with Lily Thorne, or the interruption I was going to cause, had broken the cycle. I had refused to provide the neat, tragic ending the scribe required, and in doing so, I hadn't freed it. I had enraged it. I had turned the warden into the prisoner. The fog that blanketed the town wasn't just weather, it was the raw stuff of creation, the ink of the scribe bleeding out, rewriting the town, its people, and its history into a new, incoherent horror story. The choice that stood before me was stark and terrible. It was no longer about saving one child, it was about the very nature of existence. I had two paths. Path one, I could find a way to complete the ritual, find another suture, perhaps not a child, perhaps myself. I carried the blood of the town, the trauma of its past. My own life, my own memories were a rich and sorrowful meal. I could offer myself to the scribe, become the final definitive chapter in the story of Blackwood Pines, and in doing so, perhaps restore the seal. I could become the sacrifice that saved the world from this creeping narrative cancer. I would be saving everyone outside this valley of shadows, but I would be condemning the remaining souls of the town, the blank-faced husks wandering the fog, to be the eternal, mindless guardians of my tomb. They would be saved from the scribe's chaos, but imprisoned in its silence forever. Path 2. I could embrace the chaos. I could lean into the role my father had chosen. I could tear the wound wide open. The journal in my possession, the memories in my head. I had the tools. Jonathan Reed's journal didn't just describe the ritual of sealing, it hinted at the ritual of unbinding, to open the gate, to release the Scribe of Sorrows fully upon the world. This would be an act of ultimate destruction, erasing the lie of Blackwood Pines and unleashing a conceptual entity that would rewrite reality on a global scale. It would consume history, memory, truth itself. But in a way, it felt like justice. It would be a final, terrible act of rebellion against the God that had demanded the blood of my sister, the life of Marcus Cole, the soul of Lily Thorne. It would be freeing the prisoner, even if it meant burning down the universe. I stood in that cabin, the world outside dissolving into a timeless grey fog, the painting on the wall now almost entirely black. I was standing at a crossroads, not of morality, but of cosmology. Do I become the savior who perpetuates an obscene tradition, or the destroyer who brings about an unknowable, terrifying new reality? The hero of a story of sacrifice, or the villain of a story of liberation? My mind, flooded with the memories of the lost, reeled. I felt the terror of the children, the anguish of the parents, the grim resolve of the guardians, and I felt the immense, lonely, patient hunger of the scribe itself. It wasn't evil, not in a human sense. It was simply a different kind of existence, a consciousness of pure narrative that perceived our linear lives as fleeting, edible fictions. The choice tormented me. Night and day ceased to have meaning. I paced the small cabin, the floorboards groaning under my weight. I was a ghost in a house at the end of time. I would stare at my reflection in the dark window pane, and for a moment I wouldn't see my own face, but that of my father, his eyes burning with righteous fury. Then it would shift to Brody's, weary and resigned, then to Evelyn's, torn between duty and horror. I was all of them. I contained the entire tragedy. And then the final layer began to peel back, the deepest, most terrible truth which had been hiding in plain sight all along. It came to me in a moment of utter stillness, as I watched a single drop of condensation trace a path down the window pane. It was a thought, an idea, so monstrous that my mind tried to reject it, to cast it out as madness. The loop. The 25-year cycle, the precision of it, the way the town seemed to conspire, almost unconsciously, the way I was called back, the way my past was a lie designed to lead me to a specific point in time and space. This wasn't a series of tragedies, it was a mechanism, a clockwork of souls. And I was not just a participant. I was not just a descendant. The memory of my sister Sarah, it wasn't a memory of loss. It was a memory of envy. I remembered standing there, clutched by my mother, watching her be led to the altar. And I remembered a feeling, a cold, dark spark in my young heart. Not fear for her, but a kind of resentment. Why her? Why not me? The scribe of sorrows fed on stories, on memory, on potential. What if the most potent story was not one of simple sacrifice? What if the richest meal was a story of betrayal, of a cycle perpetuated not by grim necessity, but by a hidden original sin? The truth unfurled in my mind like a black flower. My father didn't start the fire in a fit of grief. He started it to stop me. In that primordial memory, as Sarah was led to the altar, I had broken free from my mother. I had run forward, not to save her, but to take her place, or rather, to offer her up willingly. The voices of the scribe, even then, had whispered to me, the boy who felt overlooked, the brother who lived in his sister's shadow. They had promised me a story of my own, a long one, a life, in exchange for hers. I was the original sinner. I was the first betrayal. My father, seeing the terrible knowing look in my eyes, seeing that I had been corrupted, had tried to burn the whole unholy temple to the ground to stop the pact from being sealed with this new venomous twist. He failed. He died in the fire he set. My mother fled with me, the little monster, and buried the truth so deep she herself forgot it, rewriting my past to make me a victim, not the cause. But the pact had been struck. My offering had been accepted. My life, my entire existence, was the payment the scribe had given me for the soul of my sister. My decades in the outside world were not an escape. They were my reward, and the cycle of disappearances every 25 years. It wasn't a renewal of the original pact. It was the interest being paid on my debt. The town wasn't sacrificing its children to the scribe. It was sacrificing them to me, to keep my story going, to keep me alive and free in the outside world until the day the scribe decided my story was complete and it was time for me to come home and pay the principal. My return wasn't an accident. It wasn't a calling. It was a summons, the end of the line. My story was over. Brody, Evelyn, the whole town. They weren't just guardians of a seal. They were the long-suffering curators of my life, paying a horrific price for a bargain I had made as a child. Lily Thorne wasn't a suture for the world. She was the final installment payment before the repossession of my soul. My interruption of the ritual was not an act of heroism. It was a final, selfish, desperate attempt to renege on the deal, to break the contract. It was me, once again, refusing to pay. And the consequence, the unraveling of reality, was the scribe finally losing its patience, tearing up the contract and the world it was written on. I stumbled back from the window, my legs giving way. I collapsed to the floor, the horrifying truth crushing the air from my lungs. I was not the hero. I was not the victim. I was not even the villain in the way I had imagined. I was the source of the rot, the patient zero of this plague of sorrow. My entire life had been a story written in the blood of innocent children. The ghost of Marcus Cole was not just my guilt. He was a footnote in my terrible biography. The choice was gone. There was no dilemma. There was no saving the world or damning it. There was only the end of the story. My story. The cabin door creaked open, though I had bolted it shut. A small figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the grey eternal fog. It was the girl thing that had once been Lily Thorne. The darkness in her eyes seemed to pull at the light in the room. The chorus of voices spoke, not from her, but from everywhere at once. It was calm, final. The story is over, Arthur Penhaligon. It is time to write the epilogue. I didn't resist. I didn't scream. I simply looked at her, at the avatar of the being I had made a deal with so long ago, and I felt a strange sense of peace, the peace of an ending, the end of a long, selfish, and terrible book. So here I am, in the quiet, in the space between the words. I am telling you this, recording it on this old, forgotten tape, because the scribe of sorrows is a being of narrative. It has consumed me, but a story by its nature must be heard. My tale, my confession, is the new seed. It is the beginning of the next cycle. I have told you this story to pass the curse along, to plant a cutting from the weeping willow in the soil of your mind. The debt is paid, but the story is not contained. It is now a part of you. It is in the hiss of this tape. It is in the silence after my voice fades. If you ever find yourself in a small, quiet town that feels like it's drowning in rain and secrets, you were not the one who found it. It was waiting for you. If a melancholic lullaby ever drifts into your dreams, a tune about a weeping willow, do not listen to the words, do not hum the melody. A story is a key, and humming the tune is an invitation to open a door you will never be able to close again. I was the story of Blackwood Pines. I was its beginning and its end. Now the story is yours, and the scribe is always hungry for a new one. New,